perspective of microthermal energy, this is our geothermal offering from microseismic Inc.'s point of view. The title of this talk is Reservoir Fluid Movement and Induced Seismicity Monitoring with Completions Engineering at Microthermal Energy. My name is John McMahon. So we've been here for over 20 years. We're present in, we've done work in every major basin in the United States and as well as worldwide. And we have made numerous observations primarily from hydraulic fracturing, induced or injections. And what we want to do is take our observations and take it into the geothermal industry. So we have a group called completions evaluations or completions engineering, and we can apply all these different observations from hydraulic fracturing to geothermal energy. So what do we do with our completions evaluations group? Well, we look at the hydraulic fracturing program in terms of the microseismicity created, and we look at focal mechanisms from the microseismic events that tells us how the rock is breaking. And this gives us not only the location of the event in terms of X, Y, and Z, but also gives us a time component, date and time, as well as how the rock is breaking. So we look at the radiation pattern from that microseismic event. It's detected at a surface array, and we can back out how that rock's breaking in terms of the strike and dip of that fracture, as well as the break, how it's moving. So is it a dip slip? Is it slipping in the direction of dip, or is it slipping in the direction of strike? And when we have all that type of information, we can group focal mechanisms together in both time and space and solve for stress. So we can derive a theoretical stress state that minimizes the misfit angle between all the observed focal mechanisms and derive that theoretical stress state. And this is important for identifying both a virgin stress state, which is the reservoir stress state prior to your injection, plus any dynamically changing stresses. And then we can also get that tectonic stress regime, or your normal stress regime, strike slip, or reverse. And in some instances, like in the U.S., it's pretty well defined which stress regime you are, but in other places, like in Argentina, we go from normal stress regime, strike slip, to reverse in a very short distance throughout the reservoir that people are targeting. And then we can plot all this information on Mohr circles and identify the failure potential of all these different fracture planes. We can look at the required induced core pressure for each of these fractures, these different types of fracture sets, and then look at also dilation tendencies. So are these how susceptible are these fractures to dilating? Which fractures are going to dilate more than others? And that's very important in creating permeability. So we want to understand which fractures are dilating more, and how does that change as you're injecting into the reservoir as stresses are changing. So what do? We look at the surface from our surface array. When that radiation pattern is propagating upwards, we're going to see some of the array is going to experience positive polarity versus other parts of the array is going to be experiencing negative polarity. And so also we'll see higher intensity that decays away through these different loads. And the way that it does that, we see that pattern, we can fit that into a theoretical model to solve for these different types of mechanisms. And it's important to note that what we're typically showing here are just pure double couple solutions, but we also get a full moment tensor solution that gives us not only the strike, dip, and rate, but gives us other information like the CLVP component, the double couple component, and the volumetric component, telling us actually how much that those fractures are actually opening and closing. And So some of the basic terms that I'm going to be using are normal dip slip mechanisms and strike slip mechanisms. And just the dip slip mechanisms are exactly what they sound like. They're slipping in the direction of this dip, whereas the strike slip ones are slipping in the direction of the strike. And so this is an example of how we can derive a stress state solution. So we can plot all of the different focal mechanisms that we're observing on these stereo nets. And what I like to do is plot them as these slip linear vectors. They are poles to the actual strike of the plane, so they're actually 90 degrees off of the strike. So you see all these fractures are striking in this direction, and they're fairly steeply dipping, so they'd be plotting, the poles would be plotting towards the outer perimeter of the great circle. And what's nice about plotting these slip linear vectors is they all will point to a central location. In this case, they're all pointing up here, which is the minimum horizontal stress. And then the maximum horizontal stress is 90 degrees off of that. And then we can, since all the stresses are orthogonal, then we also know that in this case the vertical stress is sigma 1. So the radiation pattern, or the pattern that these create, can be compared to these different shape factors, and we can actually calculate a shape factor that minimizes any misfit to each and every one of these observed measurements. And that will tell us the amount or the degree of horizontal stress anisotropy. So you see, when you have low such horizontal stress anisotropy, in this case phi is 0.7, that means the differential stress between sigma 2 and sigma 3 is 7% of the total differential stress. And so what we would say is, in this case, it would look more like a tortilla shape versus this looks more like a cigar shape. And so the cigar shape is reminiscent of more higher horizontal stress anisotropy. So we're using actual observations and getting a theoretical model or understanding which theoretical model fits the data the best. And then we report the phi of horizontal stress anisotropy, as well as the three different principal stress orientations. So in this case, this data resembles this model most closely. This was a phi of 0.5. So you see most of the observations are dip slip in nature. So if they're dip slip, they're pointing outward. If they're more parallel to the great circle, they will be strike slip in nature. So what do we usually see in the microseismic data? Well, for an example, if you have a producing well and an injection well, like in geothermal energy, well, if you in this example, if we have an enhanced geothermal system where we're actually hydraulically fracturing each stage, this top well, if it was in this case it was treated first, we create, in this cartoon, create these red fractures, and then you go in and you create, hydraulically fracture the lower well. We have some fractures that overlap with one another. And what is going on there is you have some compounding core pressures between the two treatments. And because you change the stress on the upper well and then you shut down, when we see events that overlap with that previously treated area, we see that stresses are actually rotating, so the mechanisms are changing. When we do the inversion, we see that there's actually a rotation in the data. And so, like an example, when you look at map view, if you inject at well 1 at this location, and then you shut down, and you go off and you treat at a different location, the SH max, which is theoretically shown here as blue, you'd see some rotations in between the wells, which is exactly what we're seeing. And so areas where you have overlap, we're going to have compounding core pressures, and we typically see enhanced microseismicity as well. And we create a fully calibrated discrete fracture network And what that means is we're taking all the events, we're looking at the focal mechanism that gives us a strike and dip of those at that location. We pair the seismic moment or the energy emitted from that event with the rock properties, and we calculate the area of the slip plane. Then, depending on the length of the fracture, we can make an initial estimate on the aperture or the opening of the fracture. This is based on rock outcrop information that says the aperture is related in a power law function to the aperture of the fracture. But then we can further refine that aperture either with the focal mechanisms when we are looking at the actual volumetric component, or in a geomechanical sense, and we understand how the stresses are oriented and the orientation of these fractures. We can get another estimate on the relative magnitude of that aperture and further refine that aperture. Then what we do is we do a volumetric balancing where we calibrate the fracture model with the injected fluid volume. So theoretically, the total fracture volume should be equal to the total injected slurry volume minus any leak off into the formation. And we can measure that leak off into the formation from something like a defit. So we're doing this, we're initially estimating these fracture volumes, we're doing some refining, and then we're calibrating the total fracture volume. And then once we have that fully calibrated discrete fracture volume, we can then inject it with proppant and try to understand where that proppant is located. The way that proppant is transported on a stage-by-stage basis is defined by the microseismic events, whether they're mostly propagating off to the west or east. We follow those orientations and fill out with these proppant models. So what are some different inversions that we're seeing? This is an example taken from the Wolf Camp, where SH max is at about 80 degrees with a phi of 0.36. And like I said in this previous example, a lot of times we'll see these left lateral rotations when you've treated a well off to the left, and then you go over to the right. We'll see these left lateral rotations. Similarly, we'll also see a right lateral rotation. And what's interesting is that the fluid-induced events, or this virgin stress state events, when we look at horizontal distance from the stage center, these virgin stress state events are primarily right around the wellbore, whereas when you have these left lateral rotations, they tend to be on the left side of the wellbore, or a right lateral rotation tends to be on the right side of the wellbore. So we see these break angles actually kind of wrapping around the previously treated stage. We'll see that in a depth view as well, where they kind of wrap around these previously treated wells. And so it gives us all sorts of information, like what we would expect in terms of these rotations, and then how does that affect, like, creating fracture apertures and stimulating different fracture sets. So that's an example of the left lateral rotation, where we have the second well treated here. In between, we see kind of a left rotation and a right lateral rotation off to the right. So what does that mean in terms of fracture characteristics? It suggests that when we look at dilation tendency of those actual fractures, that virgin stress state events, which are shown in blue, this is primarily where your fluid is located, we're seeing you have creating fractures that will tend to dilate more than fractures that are occurring in these altered stress states. Similarly, you're creating more fracture volume around the wellbore, whereas after you've created these altered stress states, you're really not creating much fracture volume. But so then some of the other things that we could do, which is kind of interesting, is if all the stages are treated very similarly, we can stack all the stages on top of one another, or reference them all to their stage center, and that'll give us a better look at kind of what a typical stage from that well would look like. And so we see these stress shadow effects occur, um, and they seem to be time dependent on this stage lag time. And what I define as stage lag time is if you, for example, in this example, there's a well spaced at about 900 feet, and there's another one spaced at about 900 feet over here. So this is a horizontal distance from the stage center and longitudinal distance from the stage center. So the well would be running through like this. We've stacked all the stages on top of one another. Here we have the perforation shots for this stage shown here. And then this box is defined by your average stage length and your average wellbore spacing. So this is where this is kind of our targeted interval we're expecting to stimulate this stage or for this well. So we expect all the fluid to be in there and all the proppant to be in there. And the contours are how we've actually modeled the proppant. And what we're showing is the rate changes. So we're showing cool colors as virgin stress state, going to red colors, which is altered stress state. So in this example, there was a well over here which treated, then they went over here, treated this well, and then treated this center well with a stage lag time of 0.2 days. So we have 3 wells that are being zipper fracked, and when you treat the center well, we see that the stress is changing from this virgin stress state to altered stress state on either side of the wellbore. And this is really important because if we can, there's ways that we can actually take advantage of these stress shadows and contain the frac in between the wells. This is an example of what we see in an isolated case where your stage lag is essentially 0 days. There's no other wells treated in the area. We see mostly just virgin stress state events. Your fluid is primarily in the areas of the cool colors, and the proppant, which is modeled, which is shown here as contours, it's located right around the wellbore. So what happens when you have these long stage lag times? So in this case, almost 18 days. What we see is we treated this shallow well. This is a depth view now. We treated this shallow well, then came in and treated this one 18 days later, and we see that there is no stress shadow around this wellbore, and all the fluid and proppant is going back towards the previously treated stage because there's nothing restricting it from propagating back through all these fractures that were initially created from the shallow well. So this is a way that we're not taking advantage of the stress shadow. It's taken too long to complete the deeper well after the shallow well, and we see all the fluid and proppant going back to the shallow well and not effectively stimulating the well. So what the idea is, we want to use all our different observations, all our techniques. We have all these focal mechanisms. We have methods for creating these discrete fracture networks. We can estimate where proppant is going. We can do stress inversions. We can understand which fractures are dilating more, which ones are more susceptible to failure, what it requires to get different fracture sets to fail, what are those pore pressures, and how do these dynamic stress changes affect your stimulation. So we want to apply all these things to geothermal, and I think that it would be very beneficial to the geothermal market. We want to make sure that these geothermal projects, especially the earlier ones, are very highly successful, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure that that's going to be the case. So that's what we got. If you want to learn anything more about microthermal energy, you can scan this QR code. And also reach out to our salesperson, Annalise. She's getting married, so she's not here. She's married already. This is her beautiful picture here. So she is our geothermal representative for our offering microthermal energy. Thank you. If you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Actually, everything we've been talking about now for the last couple of days,
Yeah.
I can see visually. I'm like, oh.
Yes, you can kind of, you see these effects.
Yeah.
The way I I plot it, you can actually just see it directly. So it's very interesting. Wherever, when you stimulate like this muscle, you'll see like getting out to this other state, right where there's a overlap, the mechanism changing. So in this case, dip sliver strikes.
I think we can help you resolve that. Actually, so we've been talking about the low stress states, low strain field, or low frequency stress states. We can probably do that.
Yeah. So what I want to see is that remnant stress
Dissipates over time.
as it dissipates over time. We want to be able to see. We're seeing that in the DAS. We're seeing it in the microseismicity. So we want to have confirmation.
I'm not sure that we can see it on 17-day time scales on LDH. That's a long time. But on the shorter time scales, say a few days.
Yes. So typically for this area, we're in Wolfcamp, in the Permian Basin, that we're seeing these stress shadows remain for about 7 to 8 days and then they go away. And the reason that I believe that they're dissipating so quickly, like if you fracked a well in isolation and no other wells in the area, like for miles, these stress shadows can remain for months. But in this case, we have so many wells paired up next to one another. They've all been fracked. We're taking up all these fractures. There's other wells that have been on production. So there's sinks pressure. When you release your pressure, that pressure is going away from this entire network on the order of about 7 to 8 days. In the DJ Basin, we're seeing a longer time. Maybe but it has, major implications where your fracs get treat this well. Treat this well. Here showing the area that's already stressed, pressured up.
Yeah. And you're purely correlating
low
to
fracture volume.
Yeah.
Not creating as much fracture, just shearing the exact same features. Those fractures are already pressured up for more circles that push to the left. So it requires very low core pressure to get them to look at the virgin stress index. We're actually moving away from that pressured up area. And so that's why we want to track the virgin stress index. They're reminiscent of events propagating in the unpressured rock. And so this other area is actually restricting that slurry propagation as well, that proper propagation. So the virgin stress state events are most likely going to be better in that slurry is actually that's how we see this profit model as well. The profit model is guided by the fractures. So creating fracture volume here, it's sending profit.
which you're estimating purely on microseismic event.
Yeah.
Let's see. Now DAS comes into play.
What?
Now DAS starts to come into focus.
Yeah.
Start using low frequency components to actually see the stress shadow over short periods of time.
Yeah.
All right, we'll work on this. I reckon we can do it.
I hope so.
We'll have to continue having this chat in a lot more detail later.
Yeah. Do you have any questions? Okay. No, we put an array so, and the reason being is because on the surface, we can, like if you have, you could have 20 wells in the area, and our uncertainty of locating events throughout the whole area. When you have a downward array, your uncertainty or your protection is dependent on how far you are from how close you are or where you are. Plus, there could be like a wounded area where you can be in the other way. So, surface array.
Ambiguity as well.
Yeah, and so the surface array gives us a much better picture. plus as the rock breaks, it's much more difficult to get up in something that's like if you had gas, it's really set them up in a way that you can get a better picture of that entire radiation pattern.
Multiple wells would help.
Multiple wells, they may not always be available. They may not be in the right location. So we put them out on the surface. It's just easier. It's going to generally be more expensive, but the cost actually comes down. So it becomes more, especially if you're sync their turn it off. Collect data, keep it process it another time. I said, oh, that well was so interesting. Yeah.
Your problem with surface array is probably the vertical surface array, right?
Yeah, it is a little bit, it's actually, the nice thing is it's constant. It's going to be better for bigger events, tighter resolution. The smaller events, it's going to be a little bit higher.
Yeah, you want to be close, right? Closer you want to the
And so, and then, but we did, usually with a surface array, our arrays are designed to detect down to minus magnitude events. So I think the general consensus is when a lot of people do downhole and surface monitoring, is that we have all these questions about the downhole, but we don't really have a lot of uncertainty about the surface. And moving forward, people just say, we're just going to surface array. As long as it's economic, it makes sense. Downhole can be useful too. How do you do our main contact was a guy who lives there, an American guy. Who retired from it 10 years ago. So he lives in Adelaide, teaches at the university some. So we're over 200 actual shows. He was kind of our main contact. And we started out with Shepherd's there, and we did some this one went really well. Worked out the assignment. I think he was doing basic percentages. Yeah, it is mechanic basic. Something else. They've all moved on. Take it with them all their knowledge.